So I have a story time for you all today. This is the story of a man who confessed to his wife everything on his deathbed and didn't die. So picture this, Pennsylvania 2024, 2004, 2005. I get called to a house and the kids want to speak with me and they sit me down and tell me what's going on. So I'm wondering if the patient had a spouse in the house, why did they need a home health aide? This time I was a nurse's aide because I was a nurse's aide before I went to nursing school and I worked as an aide through nursing school. Useless information. So they call me in and it's normally like you sit down and you get to know the aide before you hire them. But no, they were calling me in to give me the deal because this job was paying a little bit higher than what I was used to. I was very excited and eager because I needed the money. So I get in there and I sit down and they say, "Do you see that house across the street?" And I said, "Yeah, beautiful house." He goes, "We own that house too." Um, Around 1960 something, 1970 something, the dad and mother purchased this house, and the dad had went to the grocery store one day and came back and told his wife how he met these two amazing young men, and they had a single mom and they seemed like they were down on their luck and that he wanted to rent that house out to this family. So it was a mother, two sons. And they were working on their third child. And the wife was a stay-at-home mom taking care of the kids. The husband had a well-to-do job in construction. And she said, absolutely. So over the years, the wife and the family, the three kids, and the husband befriended the lady that they rented the house to, and they become like family themselves. And the kids were always over across the street. The other boys that belonged across the street were over playing with their kids. They all took a liking to each other. They were all around the same age, except for the youngest one that she was pregnant with when they initially moved this young lady across the street. And they seemed just like one big happy family. The wife, became like sisters with the young lady. They helped each other out. They cooked dinner, shared holidays together, and just came really, really, really close. Um, and so every now and again, the mom didn't like that the husband was over across the street because she felt like, a lot of the things that were going on with the house was necessary for him to go over. They could have hired a contractor of sorts to go over and tend to some of the things in the house. But those were just passing thoughts, nothing that they put too much into. But the mom always had a suspicion. She just felt like he's over there entirely too much. And she just, it would cause not arguments, but uncomfortable conversations at times. So eventually, um, the kids got grown and moved out, and the lady ended up moving out of the house and went on with her life somewhere. They kept in touch, but it was very sporadic. So the kids, however, built these great relationships, and the kids kept in touch. Some of them went to college. I think they went to Penn State together, two of them, and they just, became friends, like siblings. Well, fast forward to when I'm getting there, the dad took ill, was having a stroke, went into the hospital, and wasn't doing well at all. They didn't expect him to make it, and they called in all the family, the kids, and the kids' spouses and things of that nature. And the other two boys that lived across the street showed up probably before his biological children actually got there. And the wife just kind of looked and thought that was odd, like, why are you here? And the one was married and brought a spouse. And they're kind of looking, and they seem to be very distraught, like more distraught than they should be for just him being the across the street neighbor and landlord. So as the other kids kind of trickled in, they were all there when the father said, "I want to tell you all something. I've been going on with this charade for some time." And they said it was like a movie. The mother of the two boys walks in at the end, and she seems distraught as well, but she had remarried and gone on. But the wife still didn't understand, and then the three children that belonged to this man still didn't understand how these folks got here and why they're here and why they're so upset. Why are they as upset as the children? Because it's been years since they've all had been together. The father says in front of them all, "I think that you all should know that those are my sons as well." He had those boys with that lady while he was married to their mom, and he never met her at the grocery store. It was intentional that she needed a place to live, and he said that he would provide for her and those kids until they were grown, and he did just that. So, for the better part of 20 years, a wife shared a life with her husband's mistress and his children, along with her children, her entire life. And whenever she would make up things like things were uncomfortable over there, he would make her gaslight her, make her think that she was crazy. And for 20 something years, this man lived a life where he comforted both of his family members. And then he didn't die. He had to go home with this lady, which is where I came in. I was there to care for him, but to also be a referee, because the first 2 weeks he was home, she was whooping his behind. She was definitely a woman scorned, and my job was to ensure that I kept him safe from her. And it was a job. I would wake up some nights because I lived in, and I would sleep overnight. I would wake up some nights to her with a pillow, trying to put it over his face, trying to push him out the bed. And she just, essentially for me, I would say she lost her mind. She was no more good. And eventually she got some dementia, and she ended up dying before he did, of a broken heart. She literally lost her mind because her entire life she lived was a lie. And this man had two separate families living across the street from one another, getting the best of both worlds.
These are a list of shocking deathbed confessions. Number 1. When my grandmother was on her deathbed at 98 years old, she confessed that our grandfather, the one that we all thought was her one and only husband, had actually been her second husband. She had been married previously and had 2 children within that marriage, but that the first husband had been extremely abusive, so one day she unalived him, set the house on fire, and dropped the 2 kids off at a nearby orphanage. On her deathbed, she regretted never reaching out to her first 2 children and explained to them what really happened. Number 2, my mom's uncle and wife were extremely wealthy. Unfortunately, they acquired all of this money by doing a bunch of illegal things. On his deathbed and in anguish, he screamed out, "No, Satan, take all of my money, but leave me alone." And number 3, my grandfather, who had never been a religious man, the night before he died kept saying that there were these dark beings that were surrounding him. He couldn't figure out what they were, but that there was one in particular that really terrified him. Whatever this was, he knew that it was there waiting for him.
Here's a good deathbed confessional story. Well, this is not from me. Unfortunately, I have no good, juicy deathbed confessions. So this terminally ill patient confessed on his deathbed that he killed his twin brother while they were both in the Vietnam War in Vietnam, took his identity, then returned to the U.S. as the other twin brother so he could be with his twin brother's wife. Him and this wife stayed together, had children. He never told anybody he was the other twin. Now, this story sounds crazy, and the children of this man say that he's delusional, he had dementia, and he made this all up. However, they found a written confession in an old Bible that he wrote. He wrote this confession a long time ago and put it in this Bible, and then they found it. So I don't know. Now, I will say my source for this is BuzzFeed, so who knows, but it's still entertaining.
Rather than, they would give me pieces of UFOs and I would come to my laboratories. I had the laboratories of Lockheed and every place else. So I would do that, but I would get pieces of UFOs. For example, I have 3 little pieces of UFOs down underneath the thing that looks like a quartz crystal. Notice that that is my hand, and it is giving weight. It says that it weighs 100 grams. Now, without those 3 items, when I take the UFO material away, notice that the three UFO items are gone. But also notice that the weight of the crystal is now 650 grams. The implication here is that if I were to take the pieces of UFO and put them underneath an average man's scale, he would weigh 45 pounds. Basically, they're working in anti-gravity, and therefore our effort is anti-gravity. Now, not only that, but we take these same pieces of items and I go to a standard voltmeter, and notice that in my voltmeter I am getting a total voltage of 249 volts out of one rock, one piece of UFO. Not only that, but the team took a piece of UFO and connected it up like this and was able to have a complete laboratory operate for 6 months with heavy equipment. And it goes all the way up to 12 amperes. And since you didn't really get this before, here's the foot with the toes joined together. And this is a better view of the same. Now notice also, this is the body of an alien, and where we have 6 ribs that are connected together, they have 3. And the total height is less than 5 feet. And they still look like this, not like you and I. Nevertheless, so we're able to obtain voltages and anti-gravity, and anti-gravity appears several ways, which is rather unique and nice. Scotty talked about UFOs. I basically said, yeah, I understand, because here is what Area 51 was giving to me since the year 2000 and beyond. Notice it's recent, and we have one triangle, then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we have one that's 150 feet across, if not larger. And each one of these are separate documentation of UFOs that were photographed and taken across the world from the year 2004. Now, when you actually get what that all means, is a UFO, when it's white on the underneath side, is ready to fly like that. And it's anti-gravity, that's the reason you don't hear anything. But when it's just parked means just floating in air. It could be above your house, like this, and this. This turns out to be the heads-up display that the aliens see of how to go to Area 51 and store their craft. Nevertheless, this is what the craft looked like. That's how they change power. And notice that here's an egg-like thing, but it's standing on end, only because it has no gravity itself. And that is a piece of UFO germanium. And this little dot is a piece of neodymium magnet, which is above the germanium, and it's floating all by itself. And that again is a UFO. And we don't know why, but the crystal appears to be colored rose, and we can't figure out why yet. Now, there's a whole batch of analysis that we're having to do. Alien, side view, front view, top view, line. And that's the power center of palladium in the middle of the craft. In case I missed anything.
Huge disclaimer, this is not my story. I may forget bits and pieces of the story as I go along because this all went down last summer. Basically, on Twitter, there was a nurse that was saying the amount of times I've heard a racist confess something heinous to me while they were in hospice care, I've lost count. And other nurses took the screenshot and replying to it on Nurses of TikTok and were making videos of how racist people were on their deathbeds and were explaining how their patients were begging for forgiveness and stuff like that. Trigger warning to this story. So the story goes, a nurse was attending to a patient who was in hospice care. The patient then confesses to the girl that she basically lied and was envious of a little black girl in her family because the little black girl had a cute dress. The patient also admits that she lied on the brother of the black family, basically saying that the little boy touched her. And you know how that song and dance goes. She went to the community, started crying, the works and everything, and the community got worked up and went to the people's house. And so the people rolled up on the black family, burned their house to the ground, hung the little boy, chopped off his private parts as punishment. And she can still remember the flames of the house. After that, the patient tells the girl, or the nurse basically, not to leave her side because she sees a little black boy in the corner of her room staring at her. And the girl basically went, "It's above me now. It's out of my control." Somebody said it was on Reddit, the deathbed confessions, and basically there were CNAs, nurses, and staff basically retelling tales of these racist people that were on their deathbed confessing to heinous crimes. There was one where, of course, cops were saying, I pulled over people just out of spite and all that kind of stuff. But then the women's were like, they were a part of some heinous mess. Like another significant one was another patient who was on her deathbed, of course, and was a nurse. And she admitted to killing a bunch of black babies. She was a labor and delivery nurse. Some would be a feel good of like the wife finally leaving an abusive relationship and, magically they husbands got sick. But then the ones that were like jaw to the floor, people were wilding, and they're still like their descendants are maybe 50, 60 years old. It just made me really sick to my stomach reading some of these stories and hearing nurses my age talk about it. And I wish I could tag the person who it was, but it made the news. It was really it was big.
Craziest things people confess before passing.
So on her deathbed, my great grandma had a shocking revelation that she gave to us all. So picture it. She was 92 at the time, I think. And she broke her hip, got an infection. They did not think it was looking really good. She was in the hospital. Her 8 kids were all there with my parents. They were all talking, just trying to say goodbye just in case. And she said, "My one regret is that my son can't be here with us." Hold up. What? Because your son right there, your other son's right there, your other son's right there, your 5 daughters are over there. We don't know anyone else that's involved on this bus. Like this is it. This is the whole roster. So what do you mean, your son?
This woman goes on to tell us the saddest but craziest story about how when my grandfather was about 4, she was in a very abusive marriage, and her ex-husband used to almost daily was very violent, very, very aggressive with her, and honestly just a very horrible person. He was off serving in World War II when she fell in love with and had an affair with the mailman. Literally, the mailman is what she told us. And she was so afraid that when he came back from war, if he saw her pregnant, she knew for certain that he would just right then and there kill both her and the baby and all of their kids. So my grandpa and his 2 younger sisters. She knew for a fact that if he came back from war and she was pregnant, he was going to kill the entire family. So she was terrified for all of their safety. So this woman, completely concealed, completely hidden for 9 months, didn't tell a single person that she was pregnant, put the baby up for adoption while she was still in the hospital, came back to her 4-year-old son, 1-year-old and 2-year-old children, and just lived life like nothing happened. Her husband came back from war. He eventually ended up leaving them when my grandpa was 8. Never spoke about it again. Never told a single soul for 70-something years. And then on her deathbed, tells us that that was her biggest regret, was never getting to meet him. So then she miraculously does recover and doesn't pass away for a few more years. So we take that as a sign of this is the time, this is why she got sick, was for us to find this out. She recovered, and this is a sign that we need to find who this man is. At the time, he would have been like 70 years old. So we wanted to like really think how to find him. So we went on 23andMe. That was the first step of us. It was like, there has to be someone that's related. It isn't that big of a town. My mom gets a match, and it was her cousin. She pulls up, this lady looks just like her, looks just like my mom. It is freaky. Pulls it up, and she's like, hey, do you have a dad? And she's like, yeah. Why? And my mom asked about her dad and was like, hey, was he put up for adoption in like the early 50s, or I guess it would have been 45, in like 1945? And sure enough, he was the only other person in that small town that my grandpa just happened to not know, that went to the same school as him, went to school with my grandfather his entire life. My grandfather said he's probably ran into him a few times and then just never realized that was his brother. And at 72 and 80 and 94, we were able to, because they didn't live too far off, we were able to bring my great grandma and her son, and they got to meet. And she passed away 2 years after that. So I'm pretty sure that that was the only way her soul would leave her body peacefully, was that she met her baby and got to know that he was raised in a loving home and that it was all okay.
What is some of the craziest stuff people have confessed to as they're dying? Well, in this series, I'm going to read to you some of the craziest ones I could find.
So my second cousin sent me this series last night, and I had a good laugh because our family has a few deathbed stories, but we have one that's really good, and it comes from my great-great Aunt Dorothy. Well, kind of. Like, it actually starts with her dad and then turns into a double whammy with her. So for context, this is my great-great Aunt Dorothy, and if you're looking at her and you're like, wow, she kind of looks familiar, that is because I've posted quite a few videos with my great-grandma Eva right here, and Dorothy is actually her baby sister. So to understand the double whammy from the story, you have to go back to the original deathbed confession, and that was from their father. So these are their parents, that's Arthur and that's Julia. So they got married in 1920 and they had a crap ton of kids. They literally had 9 kids in 13 years, and the only reason they even stopped having kids was because towards like the last pregnancies, my great-great-grandma Julia kind of started losing her mind, and so she was institutionalized, which is why there started being gaps between the pregnancies because she kept trying to harm herself. And then during her last pregnancy, she ultimately tried to end her own life, and that resulted in complications, and when she gave birth, they saved the baby and not her. So my great-great-grandpa Arthur, that's him right there when he got older, he ended up living a pretty long life, but he never remarried. He just raised his 9 kids on his own. Everybody really looked up to Arthur because of that, because he stuck around, he raised all his kids, didn't remarry, whatever. So he was like, very idolized in our family. Like, we have a ton of people who named their kids after Arthur. As a matter of fact, so many people in my family named their son after Arthur that we have so many Arthur and Bensons, because that was his middle name, in our family, that when I went to go name my oldest son, I went to our family tree and I looked up Arthur's family, and then I named my son Ainsley after one of Arthur's uncles. Also, this is my great-great-aunt Irene, which is another one of the sisters. That is totally a different woman from the other 2 pictures. People always ask me how I have so many family stories and photos and stuff, and that's because when your immediate family all dies young, you seek out the older generations. So when I was a teenager, I went and looked for Julia and Arthur's kids who were still alive. And that's when I connected with my great-great-aunt Dorothy. And honestly, we talked once and she told me a bunch of stories and sent me a bunch of pictures. And then we didn't really talk again for years. Not until I took a DNA test. And then when my DNA came back, I did not match Arthur. Now, I knew who Arthur's parents were, who all of his siblings were, etc., because Dorothy had given me his full name, his birthday, his date of death, etc., so I was just able to pull up all the records and then just attach it to my family tree. But I did not match that man's family, so I was like, what on earth? So I called my great-great-aunt Dorothy, and I'm explaining to her what's going on, and I'm like, I think maybe Julia had an affair. And she's like, oh my gosh, my mother would never. If I haven't mentioned, my family is extremely religious. So I'm like, Dorothy, there's no other explanation for why I do not connect genetically to this man. I am not genetically related to Arthur Townsend. There's not a DNA ping. I am not related to this man. And she's like, all right, well, I'll tell you this, but you have to promise not to tell anybody. And I was like, okay, fully knowing that I'm going to tell whoever wants to listen to me talk. And she tells me when Arthur was on his deathbed, he calls all of his kids to the room. They hover around his hospital bed, and he tells them his final deathbed secret. And that is that his name is not actually Arthur Townsend. He lived in a different state, and he was married and he had kids. And then his wife and his kids perished in a fire. And instead of sticking around, to talk to the police, he just decided to move states and take over an entirely new identity. This wasn't just a made-up identity either. He literally took the identity of somebody else who had passed away, and just lived with that identity. My aunt told me he acted that way out of grief, but honestly, I find the whole situation to be extremely suspicious. When your wife and kids randomly die, you don't just up and move away and say nothing to nobody and change your identity. That makes no sense. Anyway, she did tell me what his real identity was, so I was able to pull that up with my DNA, and that was in fact a match, so Julia did not have an affair after all. So that means I did in fact name my son after somebody that I am not even related to. Don't know who that is, but it is what it is. Oh, the double whammy for the story is my great-great-aunt Dorothy was doing fine medically. She was perfectly fine. That day, before I had spoke to her on the phone and she had told me this, she had gone out with my cousin Lisa and she had done, I don't know, they had done something. And then the next morning, my cousin Lisa calls me and tells me that her mom passed away in her sleep, and she's super upset because there was nothing wrong with my aunt. Nobody knows why. She wasn't on her deathbed, but she just died.
This man got away with a murder for over 30 years, but on his deathbed he confessed. But it didn't go the way he thought it was gonna go. James Brewer had shot and killed one of his coworkers when he was working at a factory. He thought the man was having an affair with his wife, so he shot and killed him. Then him and his wife moved to a different state. And he had been living under a false alias for 30 years. One day he had a massive stroke and he thought for sure he was gonna die. And he wanted to clear his conscience, so he confessed to the murder he committed 30 years ago. But he ended up surviving the stroke and making a full recovery. And as soon as he was healthy enough, he was arrested immediately after and charged for the murder he committed 30 years ago. Cannot escape karma. Crazy stories, follow my Instagram.
Craziest things people confess before passing, part 1. So, most of these stories come from Reddit, but kicking it off strong. So, there was an old woman who had pretty much gone downhill, and she was down to her last week of being alive. So, for this last week of her life, she asked the nurse to read the Bible to her. So, the nurse agrees to read her the Bible, and as soon as she starts each time, the woman begins to scream and start freaking out that he's coming to get her, and that someone is standing behind the nurse. On her last days, the woman finally admitted who was coming for her. The devil, because she had allowed her husband to SA her kids and did nothing about it. The next one follows a grandpa who had joined the military after World War II. He and his 6 brothers all joined, and they were all placed on different squadrons. During Grandpa's time in the military, his squad would cross paths with his brother's squad, and his brother would end up being shot and pass. Grandpa confessed that after this, it just made something snap inside of him. He said he used the rest of the war to take out his anger and his hurt on all these Korean troops. Pretty much going from very inexperienced and shy to a machine that would pretty much unalive anything that crossed his path. And if you were one of the unfortunate ones to cross his path, he would beat you, kick you, stomp you, completely just torture you, cutting off your fingers and doing anything to just cause more hurt to you. No one in his family, even his wife, knew about these things, and they just knew him as a very gentle, loving, kind-hearted grandpa.